A woman thanked Dr. Gu for his treatment, but he modestly said he was just doing his job. However, the woman insisted on getting his phone number, hoping to introduce him to her daughter. Before Gu could respond, Dr. Jiang intervened, explaining that Gu was already in a relationship with their colleague, Dr. Gao Shi. Despite this, the woman persisted, and Gu reluctantly gave her a number before leaving. When the woman called the number, she realized he had given her the hospital's number, not his own. Frustrated, Gu retreated to his office, fuming about the encounter. Just then, a young woman entered and blamed him for leaving the gastroenterology department, revealing that she had joined because of him. This woman was Dr. Gao Shi, and although Gu confirmed his decision to leave was final, he hinted he might reconsider. Meanwhile, Lin Xiao was distracted during her college cello audition, causing her to perform poorly. Disappointed, she called her friend San, expressing frustration that her parents hadn't supported her. Sensing her mood, San invited her out to a nightclub. When they met, San insisted that Lin Xiao ditch her academic look, quickly styling her hair and applying makeup to transform her appearance. As they headed to the club, Gu passed by on his way to his cousin's birthday party. At the club, Gu's cousin Cheng teased him for being overdressed and urged him to socialize, joking about Gu's lack of romantic experience. However, Gu could only comment on women's physical flaws, offering clinical assessments of their appearance, which left Cheng in disbelief. Meanwhile, Lin Xiao was having her first nightclub experience and drank recklessly, despite San's efforts to stop her. She tells her friends that her father was a high school principal for 20 years, which make him so serious and practical. At home, Lin Xiao's father, Mr. Lin Jian, grew anxious as he realized she hadn't returned after her exam. He tried to call her, but her phone was off. His wife, Li Hui, suggested her phone had likely died, but Mr. Lin Jian blamed her for being too lenient with their daughter. Back at the club, Lin Xiao drunkenly declared to her friends that she would no longer live in fear of her father, posting a photo online with their location tagged. When Mr. Lin Jian saw the photo, his worry turned to anger, and he rushed to the club. Lin Xiao, seeing her father approach, panicked and hid at Dr. Gu's table. Mistaking her for a flirt, Gu assumed she was looking for Cheng, who had left. Lin Xiao sat next to Gu, leaning on him for support. Gu, concerned about her dizziness, insisted she needed to be hospitalized. Embarrassed, Lin Xiao grabbed his jacket playfully, irritating Gu, who scolded her harshly. The argument caught Mr. Lin Jian's attention, and he confronted Gu, demanding to know who he was. In a bold move, Lin Xiao claimed Gu was her boyfriend. Gu immediately denied it, but Mr. Lin Jian, furious, accused Gu of being the type of man who would abandon his daughter. Lin Xiao, frustrated, argued that at least Gu had been there for her, unlike her father, who hadn't even attended her first concert or exam. The confrontation escalated, with Lin Xiao defiantly holding Gu's hand and declaring him her boyfriend. Mr. Lin Jian, furious, berated Gu for letting a student like Lin Xiao drink and accused him of having no shame. Gu, feeling humiliated, stormed out of the club, chastising Cheng for bringing him there. He felt deeply disrespected by the entire situation. Later, back at home, Mr. Lin Jian dragged Lin Xiao inside, demanding she remove her makeup. She stood her ground, insisting that she was a university student and a skilled cellist, no longer a child to be controlled. Mr. Lin Jian harshly called her a failure, declaring that her only focus should be her studies until she became a professor, the only career path he deemed acceptable. Fury surged through Lin Xiao as she defiantly proclaimed that she would follow her dreams of becoming a cellist, rejecting the idea of being a professor and expressing disdain for the thought of ending up like her father. As she stormed out, Mr. Lin Jian clutched his stomach in pain, urging his wife, Li Hui, to hurry with his medicine. The next morning, Li Hui casually mentioned that Mr. Lin Jian had gone on a fishing trip, but Lin Xiao seemed indifferent. Concerned, Li Hui urged her to be kinder to her father, emphasizing that he only wanted the best for her. Suspicious, Lin Xiao noticed her father's treatment prescription and asked about his condition. Li Hui quickly snatched the papers away, insisting everything was fine. Determined to uncover the truth, Lin Xiao followed her mother to the hospital. When Li Hui was told the doctor was unavailable, she headed to the restroom, giving Lin Xiao a chance to investigate. At the reception desk, Lin Xiao saw her father's treatment papers and took a quick photo. Just then, Dr. Gu appeared, recognizing her. When Lin Xiao claimed she was taking photos for her tests, Dr. Gu grew suspicious, especially after seeing her father's name on the paperwork. When she insisted that it was her father's, Dr. Gu threatened to call security, prompting Lin Xiao to flee the hospital. Meanwhile, in another part of the hospital, Dr. Gao Shi diagnosed Mr. Lin Jian with a stomach ulcer and stressed the urgency of treatment. Li Hui, relieved, thanked Dr. Gao Shi but remained unaware of Lin Xiao's discovery. However, Dr. Gu later contacted Li Hui, expressing concern that Mr. Lin Jian's condition might have progressed to stomach cancer and urging her to bring him in for further tests. Despite this warning, Mr. Lin Jian stubbornly refused to return to the hospital. Determined to get him there, Li Hui devised a plan. She called him, falsely claiming that Lin Xiao had appendicitis. Although he knew it was likely a lie, concern for his daughter drove him to the hospital. Upon arriving, Mr. Lin Jian found Dr. Gu, who playfully probed Lin Xiao's side after she pretended to be in pain. When she confirmed that it hurt, Dr. Gu dramatically announced she needed surgery. Startled, Lin Xiao confessed the truth, admitting the ruse to get her father to the hospital. Gu, exasperated, declared she wasn't a patient, but Lin Xiao pointed out that her father was. Li Hui, flustered, then rushed in, claiming she couldn't find Dr. Gu. With a sigh, Gu led them to his office, explaining that further tests were necessary to rule out anything more serious regarding Mr. Lin Jian's ulcer. Mr. Lin Jian, still convinced he was fine, angrily refused and stormed out. Dr. Gao Shi later warned Gu about his intense involvement with patients, referencing a past scandal involving a doctor who faced backlash for insisting on additional testing. Frustrated, Gu told her to stay out of his work. Outside, Li Hui tearfully confronted her husband, reminding him of the sacrifices she had made for him and expressing her heartbreak over his lack of appreciation. Moved by her words, Mr. Lin Jian reluctantly agreed to the tests, telling her he would do it for her peace of mind. Meanwhile, hospital management convened to discuss a critical patient, and Dr. Gu advocated for chemotherapy over more drastic surgery. The meeting concluded with the director siding with Gu, bolstering his reputation. However, as Lin Xiao passed by, she overheard other doctors speculating that Gu's influence was due to family connections, casting doubt on his integrity. Elsewhere, Cheng continued to pursue San, still fixated on their nightclub encounter, but Sen consistently rebuffed his advances. Back at the hospital, Lin Xiao brought snacks to a young boy named Qiu Qiu, who shared a room with her father. Dr. Gu entered, reminding them that Qiu Qiu needed to stick to a strict diet after surgery. He then inquired about Mr. Lin Jian's test results, and Li Hui replied that they were still waiting for a final decision. As Dr. Gu stepped out of the room, he overheard Lin Xiao warning her parents not to trust him, accusing him of being unprofessional and relying solely on his connections with the hospital director. Infuriated by her remarks, Gu confronted the hospital manager, requesting a transfer. However, the manager reassured him, explaining that his request had been delayed because of his recognized skill and professionalism. Returning to his office, Gu was overwhelmed with frustration and anxiety. His hands trembled as he picked up a pair of medical scissors, but he quickly set them aside, struggling to regain his composure. Meanwhile, Dr. Gao Shi gently continued her examination of Mr. Lin Jian, who nervously denied experiencing any symptoms despite the pressure he felt. On the rooftop, Gu overheard Lin Xiao expressing doubts to San, saying she believed her father was lying about his symptoms. She voiced her distrust of Dr. Gu and mentioned wanting to find another doctor. Cheng, who was with them, defended Gu, claiming he knew him well. Feeling uneasy, Gu left the rooftop. Later, in Mr. Lin Jian's hospital room, Lin Xiao broke down in tears, overwhelmed with worry for her father. Dr. Jiang, noticing her distress, suggested she leave for the night, but when he returned, she was still there. Moved by her tears, he allowed her to hide in the doctor's rest room to stay close to her father. When Lin Xiao entered the rest room, she was startled to find Gu changing his clothes. She tried to leave, but Gu stopped her, demanding to know why she was there. She explained that Dr. Jiang had given her permission. Adhering to hospital protocol, Gu insisted it was against the rules, but Lin Xiao begged him not to report Dr. Jiang, saying he truly cared about his patients, unlike Gu, who she viewed as cold. Gu felt conflicted by her words, kicking her out but immediately regretting it. When he called her back, Lin Xiao stubbornly refused to return, although she eventually slipped back into the room to sleep. When Gu returned, he saw her resting peacefully and felt a strange sense of calm. The next morning, Lin Xiao found a note with instructions for her father's care, along with an ice pack. Grateful, she thanked Dr. Jiang, though he seemed confused, not knowing it was Gu who left it. As she left the room, she bumped into Gu and overheard Sen complaining about the effort it took to find a good doctor. Gu interrupted, revealing that he was the very doctor they were looking for, urging Lin Xiao to trust him because he was the only one capable of helping her father. Gu confronted Lin Xiao, insisting that her personal feelings toward him shouldn't endanger her father's health. He emphasized the urgency of the situation and her father's need for immediate care. Despite her initial silence, Lin Xiao seemed to reconsider as Gu reminded her of the stakes. Back in Mr. Lin Jian's room, Lin Xiao found her mother, Li Hui, distressed over Qiu Qiu's upcoming surgery being cancelled due to lack of funds. Determined to help, Lin Xiao pleaded with her parents to support the boy, and they agreed. Just then, Dr. Jiang entered with Qiu Qiu's mother's credit card, revealing that Gu had raised the funds for the operation. Qiu Qiu's mother expressed gratitude, calling Dr. Gu kind, even if he didn't always show it. Suddenly, a commotion broke out as a patient was rushed in, bleeding profusely. Dr. Gu took control, leading the medical team to the operating room. Despite his rising panic, he pushed through the procedure, aware of the stakes. After the surgery, Dr. Gao Shi praised him for his composure, suggesting that there was no need for him to transfer. However, Gu snapped back, insisting that he alone understood his condition. Meanwhile, Mr. Lin Jian began feeling symptoms of the condition Dr. Gao Shi had warned him about. Frustration grew as he worried that the test results would confirm his worst fears. Lin Xiao, seeing her father's distress, urged him to reconsider and undergo further testing, but he stubbornly refused, declaring he was leaving the hospital. Outside the hospital, Lin Xiao encountered Gu and shared her frustration over her father's refusal to get the tests. As she left in tears, Gu decided to intervene. He stopped Mr. Lin Jian at the receptionist's desk just as he was about to sign his discharge papers. Confronting him, Gu explained that if anything happened to him, his family would carry the guilt for the rest of their lives. Touched by the doctor's words and recalling his daughter's tears, Mr. Lin Jian reluctantly agreed to proceed with the tests. When the results came back, the family was devastated to learn that Mr. Lin Jian had cancer. Li Hui broke down, and Lin Xiao tried to comfort her, insisting they would get through it together. In his room, Mr. Lin Jian remained cheerful, unaware of the severity of his condition. However, Li Hui confronted him firmly, demanding that he stop smoking immediately, given his critical condition. Mr. Lin Jian brushed her off, insisting it was just a stomach ulcer and that everything would be fine. When Li Hui discovered his hidden cigarettes, he claimed he was only smelling them, not smoking. Overwhelmed by the tension between her parents, Lin Xiao stepped outside, her emotions in turmoil. As she wandered through the hospital, young Qiu noticed her tears and offered her a small lollipop, but Lin Xiao politely declined, saying she needed some air. Seeking solace, she climbed to the rooftop, her tears flowing freely. Concerned for her well-being, Qiu rushed to find Dr. Gu, informing him that Lin Xiao was crying on the rooftop. Gu, alarmed by the danger, instructed Qiu to stay away from such areas but decided to check on Lin Xiao himself. He found her sitting alone, still sobbing. Initially considering leaving her to her thoughts, Gu changed his mind after hearing her quiet cries. Instead of offering comfort in the usual way, Gu began listing the potential health risks of crying, mentioning high blood pressure, eye swelling, and even atherosclerosis. Lin Xiao, recalling their earlier nightclub encounter when he had similarly worried about her dizziness, found his reaction ridiculous. However, Gu then reassured her that her father's cancer was treatable and that with proper care, he had a good chance of recovery. Lin Xiao, through her tears, looked at Gu and asked if he had known about her father's condition before the tests. When he nodded, she teetered on the brink of another breakdown. To distract her, Gu pulled out his headphones and placed one side on her ear, the other on his own, playing soothing music. As the melody played, Lin Xiao's face softened, and she recognized the piece. When Gu asked how she knew it, she excitedly shared that she was a cellist, diving into the story of the composer and the challenges he faced. Gu felt a small sense of accomplishment as he managed to draw a smile from her amidst the chaos. Later, Li Hui and Lin Xiao met with Dr. Gao Shi and the surgeon scheduled to operate on Mr. Lin Jian. The surgeon delivered difficult news: the cancer was in a critical area, and removing the entire stomach might be the only solution. Fear gripped both women. Remembering Gu's earlier reassurances, Lin Xiao voiced her concerns. The surgeon, visibly irritated by the mention of Gu's name, sternly asserted that this was his patient and insisted that removing the stomach was the only way to prevent the cancer from returning. After the surgeon left, Lin Xiao, desperate, begged Dr. Gao Shi to convince Gu to take charge of the operation. Gao Shi explained that Gu had decided to transfer departments and the only way he could treat her father was if Lin Xiao could persuade him not to leave. She emphasized how crucial it was, as Gu was the most skilled surgeon in the hospital. Determined, Lin Xiao tracked down Dr. Gu and, with pleading eyes, took his hand. She confessed that she trusted him alone and begged him to handle her father's case. But Gu remained firm, reiterating that he was transferring out of the department. In desperation, Lin Xiao mentioned that the other doctor planned to remove her father's entire stomach, but Gu's cold response was to suggest she discuss the matter with that doctor. Frustrated, Lin Xiao pulled out a bottle of anti-hair loss shampoo, hinting at the stress he might be under. This only irritated Gu further, and he dismissed her, asking her to leave. Sitting back in his chair, he smirked, casually patting his hair. Shortly after, Dr. Gao Shi approached Lin Xiao, asking how her conversation with Gu went. Lin Xiao, frustrated, admitted that Gu had refused to reconsider. Despite Dr. Gao Shi's continued efforts to persuade him, Gu remained steadfast in his decision to transfer. As they discussed the situation, Lin Xiao walked in, catching a glimpse of their closeness. Embarrassed, she quickly turned to leave, exclaiming, "I didn't see anything." Gu, amused, called out after her, "Weren't you looking for me?" and winked to lighten the tension. He turned to Dr. Gao Shi, apologizing for the interruption and claiming he had more pressing matters. Gao Shi, still concerned, insisted they hadn't finished their conversation, while Lin Xiao awkwardly stood nearby. As Gao Shi left, Lin Xiao teased Gu about his relationship with her, saying, "It's obvious she's an old flame. I've seen this before at school, two people who love each other but break up, and one wants to get back together while the other doesn't." Gu chuckled at her imagination, playfully telling her she could leave, but Lin Xiao was resolute. "I'm not leaving until we discuss my father's case. If you didn't like the gift I brought, just tell me what you want, and I'll get it." With a smile, Gu acknowledged her persistence and asked her to wash him an orange. As she stepped out to do so, he reviewed her father's test results with Dr. Jiang, advocating for preserving Mr. Linjian's stomach. Dr. Jiang, however, was not convinced, saying, "That's your philosophy, not mine. I'm his surgeon, and I'm not willing to take unnecessary risks. If you think you can save his stomach, do it yourself." The next day, Lin Xiao waited outside Gu's office, full of anticipation. Gu spotted her and casually mentioned that he was going for lunch, inviting her to join him. Thrilled, Lin Xiao quickly messaged her friend San, asking for restaurant recommendations. When they arrived, she was surprised to find that San had reserved a table with red roses. To her shock, the waiter mentioned it was Couples Day. Lin Xiao blushed in embarrassment while Gu smiled, seemingly unfazed by the coincidence. A wave of unease washed over Lin Xiao as she realized this was her first time dining at the restaurant, and the atmosphere felt unexpectedly overwhelming. Gu, too, seemed puzzled, recalling that Lin Xiao had previously claimed to be familiar with the place. The couple-themed menu only heightened her anxiety. Gu's expression turned serious as he remarked that he thought she had asked him there to discuss her father's surgery, not to start a relationship. Her voice trembled as she explained she wasn't interested in starting a relationship but needed Gu to perform her father's surgery. In a flurry of movement, she thrust an envelope into his hands before rushing out of the restaurant, her heart pounding with anxiety. Left alone, Gu opened the envelope and found it filled with money, a small smile creeping onto his face as he realized the depth of her determination. Later, when he handed the envelope to Dr. Jiang, the doctor raised an eyebrow, curiosity flickering in his eyes as he asked who had sent it this time. Gu explained that it was from Lin Xiao, his tone light but carrying a hint of exasperation. Jiang, catching on, excitedly asked if this meant Gu was staying in the department and would take over Lin Jian's case. But Gu shook his head, explaining that Lin Xiao had misunderstood his intentions. She thought he had refused to perform the surgery because of money. Despite the misunderstanding, Gu reiterated that he would still be transferring in a few days. Meanwhile, Lin Xiao was in her father's hospital room, carefully washing Mr. Linjian's hands when Li Hui entered with a serious expression. Concern laced her voice as she mentioned needing to talk. She revealed that while purchasing medicine, she had noticed extra money on her card, the same amount Lin Xiao had given to Gu. This revelation left Lin Xiao surprised, her mind racing as she wondered aloud whether Gu had refused the money or if there was another reason for its return. Li Hui speculated that perhaps Gu wasn't going to perform the surgery after all. But Lin Xiao, undeterred, reassured her mother with a confident smile, vowing not to give up until she convinced him. As Lin Xiao's determination to persuade Gu grew stronger, she began following him through the hospital. Almost stumbling in her pursuit, Gu caught her arm, urging her to be careful. But she remained persistent, insisting there must be a serious reason for his reluctance and offering to solve the problem together. Gu, keen to avoid the conversation, deflected her inquiry by starting a casual conversation with Dr. Jiang, asking if he had eaten yet. The odd question took Jiang by surprise, making it clear that Gu was trying to evade Lin Xiao's persistence. Sensing his attempt to brush her off, Lin Xiao felt even more determined. When Jiang mentioned he had surgery to attend, Lin Xiao seized the opportunity, suggesting he check on her father, who might need something. Gu, still trying to sidestep the situation, responded that since she was free, he was hungry and asked her to get him something to eat. Hopeful, Lin Xiao returned with sandwiches she had prepared and handed them to Gu, along with a sterilized bottle of water, knowing how particular he was about cleanliness. Gu, surprised by her thoughtfulness, raised an eyebrow and remarked on how prepared she was. But as he moved toward the bathroom, he hesitated at the entrance. Sensing an opportunity, Lin Xiao followed. Gu, noticing her presence, jokingly called out that she seemed to be following him, and Lin Xiao laughed, assuring him she would wait outside. Just then, the hospital director arrived, spotting Lin Xiao standing outside the men's restroom with a perplexed expression. When he stepped out, he found Gu lingering at the entrance and subtly warned him to be mindful of how his actions might appear, hinting that Lin Xiao might be an old flame. Gu quickly clarified that she was the daughter of a patient, and that he had refused to do the surgery, though she had been persistently trying to convince him. Intrigued, the director raised an eyebrow and questioned why Gu was hesitant about handling the case. Before Gu could respond, Lin Xiao's voice echoed from outside, assuring him that she would give him space and return later. Lin Xiao later returned to Lia's room, her heart heavy. Inside, she found little Qiu in tears, expressing his longing for Dr. Gu to perform his surgery. The child's cries echoed through the sterile room, catching Gu's attention as he passed by. He approached Dr. Jiang, seeking permission to join Qiuqiu's surgery, a sign of his deepening connection to the young patient. As preparations for the surgery unfolded, Gu stayed by Qiuqiu's side, offering words of comfort. He reassured the boy that although Dr. Yan had performed the initial procedure, he would be there for every step of the next one, promising not to leave. Meanwhile, Dr. Jiang, weighed down by his responsibilities, clutched a massive 899-page medical book and vented his frustration to a nearby nurse about the impossibility of memorizing all the material. Turning to Gu for help, he asked how to focus on the key points. Gu's response was firm: there were no shortcuts in medicine. He reminded Jiang that doctors had to be fully prepared, as patients' lives were at stake, leaving no room for uncertainty or mistakes. Later, when Gu returned to his office, he found Lin Xiao waiting for him. He invited her in, and as she settled, she accidentally knocked over a birthday gift that Qiuqiu had given him, breaking it. Panic flashed across her face, and she immediately offered to fix it, but Gu's expression darkened. Somberly, he told her that some things, once broken, couldn't be fixed. Refusing to be discouraged, Lin Xiao carefully wrapped the shattered gift in gauze and handed it back to him, a small, hopeful gesture in an otherwise heavy moment. Seeing her persistence, Gu finally opened up. He shared the reason he couldn't perform her father's surgery, recounting a haunting memory of operating on his mentor. The surgery had failed, and since that day, his hands had trembled with the weight of guilt. Misinterpreting his feelings, Lin Xiao smiled brightly. Assuming his reluctance had something to do with the gift she had brought him, she reassured him that she would get him the hair loss treatment again, certain he'd appreciate it. Later, as she sat beside her father, Mr. Lin Jian, Lin Xiao rifled through her gift bag. Suddenly, realization dawned on her, and she clapped her hands in excitement. Everything seemed to fall into place in her mind. Her father stirred, waking up briefly to ask what was going on. Lin Xiao eagerly shared her insight, explaining that when someone trusts you enough to confide their struggles, it's important not to dismiss their feelings. Still tired, Mr. Lin Jian sighed and drifted back to sleep, leaving Lin Xiao to reflect on the conversations that weighed on her heart. Meanwhile, Gu couldn't help but smile as he recalled Lin Xiao's passionate explanation of the hair loss treatment. Her enthusiasm had brightened an otherwise serious day for him. Elsewhere, Cheng was busy tracking down San. After sharing her picture with his friends, one eventually found her at a bar. Amused by her boldness, the friend swaggered over to her, teasing her about drinking alone. San, unimpressed, demanded to know how he had found her. With a smirk, he ordered twice the amount of drinks she had, turning their encounter into a challenge. She upped the ante, daring him to drink all 6 cups if he was truly brave. The night took an unexpected turn as he accepted the challenge, drinking until he ultimately passed out. When he woke up, Sen was gone, having left a playful message on his forehead, "Idiot." Frustrated, he shot her a text, vowing not to let her get away with it. She responded cheekily, teasing that the alcohol must have given him some courage. Back at the hospital, Lin Xiao's friends arrived, concerned about Mr. Lin Jian's illness. One friend whispered about her father's cancer, but Lin Xiao quickly hushed her, emphasizing the need to keep it a secret from him. When her friend pressed her about why she was arguing with her father at such a critical time, Lin Xiao explained that maintaining an illusion of health was the best way to treat a patient. The conversation shifted when her friend shared some exciting news. The principal cellist in the orchestra had dropped out of the summer concert, offering Lin Xiao a chance to step in. Her heart leaped with excitement, and she rushed to the orchestra, eager to prove herself. However, when she arrived, the director coldly dismissed her, explaining that the team was already full, and they didn't need any additional players. Disheartened, Lin Xiao left the rehearsal, feeling crushed. As fate would have it, she wandered up to the hospital rooftop, where she found Dr. Gu enjoying a quiet moment of fresh air. She waved, but Gu quickly noticed her disappointment. After explaining that his day had been busy, he commented on her low energy. Lin Xiao, trying to stay composed, softly insisted that she was fine, though she admitted that she had just been dropped from the orchestra. Brushing it off, she added that she wouldn't give up easily. Gu listened intently, admiring her resilience despite the challenges she faced. Lin Xiao laughed lightly, sharing her quirky remedy for stress, a can of Pepsi that helped her forget the world for a moment. She then shifted the focus back to Gu, curious about his story. He hesitated before sharing the painful memory of his mentor's pancreatic cancer and the surgery he had performed, which had initially seemed successful. Days later, his mentor had experienced severe internal bleeding, ultimately dying in Gu's care. The memory still haunted him, leaving him with trembling hands. Listening closely, Lin Xiao leaned in, her expression soft with empathy. She reassured him, reminding him that it wasn't his fault and that no doctor could bear the weight of such an outcome alone. She had seen firsthand how hard he fought for his patients and understood that he blamed himself when things went wrong. "You can't change the world alone," she said gently. "Every setback is a lesson, not a punishment." Intrigued by her insight, Gu shifted the conversation to her studies, asking about her university. When she told him, a smile spread across his face as he revealed that he had graduated from the same institution years earlier. Lin Xiao couldn't resist teasing him, joking that this meant he was much older than her, though he didn't look it. She added playfully, "At least you still have all your hair." Her playful jab made Gu smile, and she added that if he used her shampoo, his hair would look even better. Their moment of connection was abruptly interrupted when Mr. Lin Jian's angry voice called out for Lin Xiao. She sighed and told Gu she needed to go. As she prepared to leave, Gu caught a glimpse of how controlling her father could be, a flicker of concern crossing his face. Before she left, Lin Xiao turned back to Gu with a serious look. She told him that, regardless of whether he chose to operate on her father, she believed he was an excellent doctor and urged him not to give up on himself. With determination, Lin Xiao rushed to her father's side, her mind swirling with thoughts of holding onto her dreams. Once outside, she pulled out her phone and sent a heartfelt message to her orchestra director. She poured her heart out, admitting that her recent performance hadn't been up to par and acknowledging that she had always struggled with the cello. Yet, she insisted on her resolve to never give up, pleading for one last chance to prove herself. She hoped that her passion would sway the director's decision. As Lin Xiao wandered through the hospital, she stumbled upon a tense situation. A man was angrily shouting at Dr. Gu, blaming him for his son's deteriorating condition and accusing the medical team of failure. Lin Xiao's heart raced as she watched the confrontation escalate. When the men started to assault Dr. Gu, Lin Xiao, acting on instinct, leaped into action to intervene. In the process, she took a blow to the head, injuring herself. Alarmed, Dr. Gu immediately rushed to her side, tending to her wound. His voice was filled with concern as he asked why she would risk herself like that. Lin Xiao, her eyes flashing with defiance, told him that she had stepped in to defend him. To distract her from the pain while he stitched her up, Dr. Gu blew up a balloon for her to hold. As he worked, Lin Xiao complimented his kind eyes, feeling relieved that the stitching wasn't as painful as she had anticipated. Once he finished, she thanked him earnestly and started to leave but quickly realized she had forgotten the balloon. Turning back, she noticed his hand trembling slightly. Not wanting to embarrass him, she discreetly left without commenting. Lin Xiao called out to him again, insisting that he accompany her on an errand. He protested, saying he was busy, but Lin Xiao cleverly used her injury as leverage, claiming she got hurt because of him. Reluctantly, Gu agreed, and she dragged him to her college, leading him into a lecture hall with urgency. Inside, Lin Xiao opened up about her past struggles, revealing that she had failed her high school exams and felt lost about her future. Just when she had been ready to give up, an older gentleman had come into her life, offering words of encouragement that lifted her spirits. Taking the stage in the lecture hall, Lin Xiao turned to Dr. Gu and expressed her gratitude for his timely treatment of her father. She announced her intention to play a special piece for him. As she envisioned herself playing the cello, the scene shifted to Dr. Gu's imagination, where he pictured her performing beautifully. When she finished playing, the room erupted in applause. Dr. Gu smiled at her, exclaiming, "Bravo." As she sat beside him, honesty poured out of her. She admitted that she had initially disliked him because of his cold demeanor, but now she was certain he was a skilled and excellent doctor. Dr. Gu reflected on his painful past, admitting that after failing to save his mentor, he had never expected anyone to see him differently. Sensing the weight of his sorrow, Lin Xiao shared a profound lesson her grandfather had taught her. When a patient dies, people often assume the doctor doesn't care, but in reality, the doctor's sole focus is always on saving their patient. She assured Gu that, in her eyes, he had done his best and remained a remarkable doctor. Moved by her words, Gu confessed that many had tried to comfort him, but none had done so like she had. Just then, the security guard entered the room, prompting Lin Xiao to shout playfully, urging Gu to run. They escaped the potential trouble, laughing as they fled. Later, they settled down with soda, and Lin Xiao encouraged Gu to drink more. When he nearly choked, they both burst into laughter. Lin Xiao then checked her phone and, with excitement in her voice, announced that her director had agreed to let her rejoin the orchestra. She mused aloud that perhaps her injury from earlier had come at just the right time. Confused, Dr. Gu asked what she meant, and in her excitement, Lin Xiao grabbed his hand. Startled, Gu quickly released it and sanitized his hands afterward. Teasing him, Lin Xiao asked how he planned to start a relationship if he couldn't even hold her hand. Gu, smiling, responded that there would be solutions for that later. With a grin, Lin Xiao slipped earbuds into Gu's ears, just as he had done for her earlier. A song played with the poignant message, "There's a crack in everything, that's how the light gets in." She told him that as long as he didn't give up, miracles would happen. Elsewhere in the city, Cheng finally encountered Sen again. A challenge glimmered in her eyes as she asked if he was sure he wanted to take her on again. Unfazed, Cheng confidently replied that he never gave up. Their night began with drinks, and when he asked to taste hers, he was surprised to find it was Pepsi. With a smirk, he challenged her to drink real wine, and to his delight, she accepted. Meanwhile, Dr. Gu found himself at his late mentor's home. The warmth of the familiar surroundings brought him some comfort. His mentor's wife greeted him kindly, telling him it had been too long since they last met. She reassured him that the loss of his mentor had been an accident and that he had done everything he could. Her words brought solace to Gu's troubled heart. As Gu browsed through his mentor's old books, he stumbled upon a letter tucked between the pages. It read, "Never forget why you started." The message struck a chord with him, reminding him of the purpose that had driven him to become a doctor. With a renewed sense of determination, Gu promised himself that he would let go of the past and continue doing his best, remembering that as long as he gave his all, he had fulfilled his duty as a doctor. As Lin Xiao made her way to Mr. Lin Jian's hospital room, carrying a tray of food, she noticed the concerned look on his face as his gaze landed on the bandage on her head. His brow furrowed, and he immediately asked about her injury. Lin Xiao quickly reassured him that it was nothing serious, just a minor wound, and nothing to worry about. Meanwhile, Dr. Gu had just finished checking on young Qiuqiu, who was recovering well from his surgery. Feeling relieved, he confirmed that the boy would be discharged in 2 weeks. With that taken care of, Gu turned his attention to Lin Xiao's father. Pulling her aside, his expression both serious and hopeful, he informed her of his decision to perform her father's surgery. Determination radiated from him, and Lin Xiao felt a glimmer of hope. Concerned about Gu's earlier tremors, Lin Xiao pressed him for details. Gu reassured her that he never took a patient's life lightly and extended his steady hand as proof of his resolve. In that moment, Lin Xiao's trust in him deepened, and their bond solidified as they connected over the gravity of the upcoming surgery. Unbeknownst to them, Mr. Lin Jian, who had gone to the bathroom, overheard part of their conversation. The mention of a gastrectomy hit him hard, and panic set in. Fearing for his life, he confronted Dr. Gu, asking if his condition was truly that dire. Gu gently explained that all surgeries carried risks, especially given his age, and that the procedure was necessary due to the stomach cancer diagnosis. Overwhelmed, Mr. Lin Jian felt his world crumble. Dr. Gu, sensing his distress, promised Lin Xiao that he would do everything in his power to ensure her father's safety. Silently, Lin Xiao vowed to trust him completely. After learning about his condition, Mr. Lin Jian's behavior shifted. He woke up later, calling frantically for Lin Xiao and his wife, only to find himself alone. When they finally entered, he angrily demanded to know why they had left him, his fear and frustration boiling over as he questioned who would take care of him if something happened. Lin Xiao, caught off guard, apologized and explained that she had just been bringing him food. But Mr. Lin Jian, too upset to listen, threw the meal aside and turned away, falling into a restless sleep. Later, Mr. Lin Jian's wife, Li Hui, spoke to their daughter. She reassured Lin Xiao not to be upset with her father, explaining that his irritability was due to his illness. She also mentioned that Dr. Gu had agreed to keep the cancer diagnosis from him, advising her to continue telling him it was just a stomach ulcer. Meanwhile, Mr. Lin Jian, left alone with his thoughts, lit a cigarette despite knowing the risks. Dr. Gu's warnings about the surgery risks weighed heavily on him, and in a fit of frustration, he threw the cigarette pack away. Dr. Gu, after obtaining approval for Mr. Lin Jian's surgery, returned to his office to find Cheng lounging in his chair. Cheng, too tired to stand, apologized for the intrusion and reassured Gu that he hadn't touched anything. Curious, Gu asked why Cheng had come to the hospital. Cheng explained that his mother, who was also his aunt, had insisted he bring Gu home, joking that if he didn't, she would kill him. Meanwhile, Mr. Lin Jian's wife reminded him that he needed to rest early in preparation for the surgery the next day. A nurse entered to inform them that he shouldn't eat anything after 9 p.m. Li Hui then asked Lin Xiao to accompany the nurse to discuss the surgery details. Before leaving, Mr. Lin Jian urged his daughter to go, making sure everything was in order. However, once everyone had left, Mr. Lin Jian saw his chance. He snuck out of bed, got dressed, grabbed his bag, and left a note on the bed alongside his credit card, warning Qiuqiu not to say anything. He slipped out of the hospital unnoticed. Elsewhere, Dr. Gu arrived home to find Dr. Gao Shi helping his mother prepare dinner. Cheng, ever the joker, teased Gu about his cold demeanor and questioned why he hadn't married Gao Shi yet. Gu's mother, playfully scolding her son, reminded him to wash his hands before dinner. Back at the hospital, Lin Xiao and Li Hui returned to Mr. Lin Jian's room, only to find him missing. Panicked, Lin Xiao asked Qiuqiu, who explained that Mr. Lin Jian had left but instructed him to stay quiet. Finding a note that read, "I'm leaving," along with the credit card password, sent both Lin Xiao and Li Hui into a panic. At the same time, Gu's mother urged Gao Shi to think about starting a family with Gu, expressing how well they fit together, much to Gu's discomfort. Just then, the hospital called Dr. Gu with alarming news: Mr. Lin Jian had escaped. Dr. Gu immediately instructed Lin Xiao to stay calm as they searched for her father, assuring her that he would be there in 15 minutes. Upon arriving, he learned that Mr. Lin Jian's phone had gone silent after a call. Dr. Jiang confirmed they had reviewed the security footage, which showed Mr. Lin Jian leaving early. As the team brainstormed possible locations, Lin Xiao's mother decided to check their home, while Lin Xiao resolved to search nearby areas. When Dr. Gu pulled up, he insisted on searching together with Lin Xiao. Apologizing for being a burden, she expressed her distress over her father leaving during such a critical time. Gu reassured her, reminding her that helping his patients was his duty. As they searched, he briefly left to get her a drink, even lending her his jacket. Grateful, Lin Xiao thanked him, and they continued their search. As they drove, Gu asked why she always referred to her father as Mr. With a heavy heart. Lin Xiao shared a painful memory from her childhood. She recounted how, after trying to escape school over a fence, she was caught and taken to Mr. Lin Jian, who coldly told her he wasn't her father. The strict, harsh approach he took had always made it difficult for her to see him as a father figure. She revealed that when she ran away from home at age 9, he scolded her upon her return instead of comforting her. Tears welled in Lin Xiao's eyes as she vowed to confront her father when they found him, threatening to break his legs if he left them again. Dr. Gu listened patiently, assuring her that they would find him. Just then, Li Hui called with good news. She had received a message that Mr. Lin Jian had bought a train ticket. It appeared that he was at the station, waiting for his train while smoking and chatting with a fellow passenger about how proud he was of his daughter, who played the cello. Lin Xiao and Dr. Gu rushed to the train station. Upon arrival, they inquired with the security staff, but no one had seen him. Disheartened, Lin Xiao lamented not having a photo to show the staff, but Gu reassured her they would find him. Just then, Lin Xiao spotted her father and called out to him in concern. As she approached, Gu urged her to stay calm, reminding her that the worst was over now that they had found him. As Mr. Lin Jian sat at the train station, a mix of nostalgia and rebellion in his heart, he struck up a conversation with the men beside him. He spoke proudly of his daughter's musical aspirations, reminiscing about her talent as a cellist and how much she meant to him. When Lin Xiao found him and pulled him aside, she pleaded with him to return to the hospital, but he stubbornly insisted that he was hungry and wanted something to eat before going back. Despite her protests about the upcoming surgery, he joked that he'd eat anything. Dr. Gu intervened, saying it was fine for Mr. Lin Jian to eat, offering to call the hospital and postpone the surgery. As they waited for the food, Mr. Lin Jian pretended to enjoy his meal, recalling fond memories of Lin Xiao's childhood, how she always wanted to share a burger with him, bringing back moments from her school days when she wrote about her dreams. Tears welled up in Lin Xiao's eyes as she reflected on those memories, admitting that it felt like a lifetime ago, and she had almost forgotten about those moments. Dr. Gu watched the exchange, feeling a renewed sense of purpose as he saw father and daughter reconnecting amidst the chaos of their lives. Handing her tissues to wipe her tears, Mr. Lin Jian gently confessed that he knew he had cancer. He explained that he had overheard Dr. Gu discussing it earlier and admitted that he was deeply afraid of the surgery, haunted by memories of his school principal who had died of cancer during an operation. He expressed regret over neglecting Lin Xiao, acknowledging how little he knew about her, including her favorite food. His voice softened as he admitted his desire to make amends for all the time they had lost. Overwhelmed by emotion, Lin Xiao excused herself and headed to the bathroom. Once outside, Lin Xiao broke down, her sobs echoing in the hallway. Dr. Gu followed her, awkwardly trying to console her by suggesting that crying could raise her blood pressure and make her look scary. His attempt to lighten the mood only made Lin Xiao cry harder, questioning how he could try to comfort someone while making them feel ugly. Dr. Gu stepped closer, wrapping an awkward arm around her shoulder, treating her like a child. After she calmed down, he gently suggested they return to the hospital, reminding her that her mother was probably worried. As they drove back, Lin Xiao rested her head on her father's shoulder, finding comfort she hadn't felt in years. Dr. Gu smiled as he noticed the shift in Mr. Lin Jian's attitude. Meanwhile, Cheng returned home to face his stern father, who questioned how long he planned to continue being aimless. His father scolded him for turning down a job offer, accusing him of wasting his time chasing girls. The conversation escalated when his father threatened to cancel his credit card unless Cheng got his life together, causing Cheng to storm out. His mother, ever indulgent, chased after him, slipping him her own credit card in secret. Back at the hospital, Mr. Lin Jian finally returned, where his wife collapsed in tears of relief. She clung to his hand, guiding him inside as she sobbed uncontrollably. The next day, as Mr. Lin Jian was wheeled into surgery, his wife's tears flowed again, her fear palpable. Lin Xiao stepped in, promising her mother that everything would be fine. During the wait, Li Hui attempted to lift her daughter's spirits by pointing out how beautiful she was, playfully lamenting how much time Lin Xiao had spent with her father. They shared a light-hearted moment, reflecting on Mr. Lin Jian's youthful charm and his thoughtful gestures, like bringing home school supplies or spending his money on music records. Li Hui reminded her that appearances might matter to some, but what really counts is having a kind heart. Dr. Gu emerged from the operating room shortly after, announcing that the surgery had been a success. Overwhelmed with joy, Lin Xiao and her mother burst into tears, thanking him profusely for his efforts. Later that night, as Dr. Gu conducted his rounds, he found a note from Lin Xiao taped outside his office. It was a heartfelt message of gratitude, adorned with little hearts, bringing a smile to his face. Continuing his rounds, he peeked into Mr. Lin Jian's room and saw Lin Xiao peacefully asleep beside her father. He gently covered her with a blanket before quietly leaving, a sense of hope settling within him. Eventually, Mr. Lin Jian stirred from the anesthesia, prompting Dr. Gu to check on him. Lin Xiao joined them, and Dr. Gu casually mentioned that he had seen her perform the cello on air but noticed she seemed out of practice. He offered to help her train, and though she admitted she hadn't practiced recently, she agreed. They decided to meet the following morning for a training session. The next day, Dr. Gu encouraged Lin Xiao to participate in a charity concert at the hospital, believing it would uplift the spirits of the patients and allow her to showcase her talent. Inspired by his encouragement, Lin Xiao performed at the event, with Dr. Gu watching proudly from the sidelines. As she finished, the audience erupted in applause, but Lin Xiao looked around, puzzled. Dr. Gu had mysteriously disappeared. Back at college, Mr. Jean praised Lin Xiao for her performance and informed her that she would be the featured cellist in the next concert. Grateful, she thanked him, promising not to disappoint. Meanwhile, Cheng encountered San, who was job hunting. He offered her a position at a bar he planned to open, but she dismissed the idea, calling it too risky. When he suggested opening a cafe instead, she sarcastically replied that a bar might suit women better. Cheng, undeterred, resolved to move forward with the cafe idea, encouraging her to prepare for an interview. Later, Dr. Gu, enjoying some downtime with his colleagues, spotted Lin Xiao on the hospital rooftop. She waved him over, inviting him for a Pepsi. Filled with gratitude, she thanked him for believing in her and acknowledged that much of her success was thanks to the opportunity he had given her to perform. In a gesture of appreciation, she promised to secure him a concert ticket once they became available. The next day, Lin Xiao excitedly showed her parents the concert tickets, her heart swelling with pride over her recent accomplishments. Despite Li Hui's concern over Mr. Lin Jian's health, he insisted that he would attend the concert, urging Lin Xiao to make him proud. Dr. Gao Shi visits Mr. Lin Jian, during which Lin Xiao thanks her for her care by giving her concert tickets. However, she learns the concert conflicts with a hospital seminar. Later, Dr. Gao Shi informs Dr. Gu about the seminar, and he agrees to attend. Afterward, he notices the concert ticket on his desk, smiling as he remembers Lin Xiao's promise of a song and tucks the ticket into a book. Meanwhile, little Qiu Qiu is recovering and preparing to leave the hospital. His mother thanks Dr. Gu and offers to host a dinner for him and his colleagues, but Dr. Gu suggests throwing a birthday party for Qiu Qiu instead. During the celebration, Dr. Gu is captivated by Lin Xiao, which frustrates Dr. Gao Shi. Qiu Qiu, in a sweet moment, tells Dr. Gu he loves him and will visit again. Dr. Gu jokingly replies that he hopes not to see him in the hospital again, to which Lin Xiao adds they'd rather see him outside the hospital. Dr. Gao Shi, noticing the connection between Dr. Gu and Lin Xiao, attempts to divert his attention but is unsuccessful. In a light-hearted exchange, Qiu Qiu confides in Dr. Gu that he knows his secret, that he loves Lin Xiao because he smiles the most around her. Taken aback, Dr. Gu brushes it off. Dr. Gao Shi then arrives, reminding him of the next day's surgery and subtly hinting about the concert tickets. She admits she received an invitation too, leaving Dr. Gu to ponder his feeling. Later, Lin Xiao, sitting next to Mr. Lin Jian, notices Dr. Gu at the door and greets him. While tending to Mr. Lin Jian, Dr. Gu clarifies to Lin Xiao that his relationship with Dr. Gao Shi is purely professional. They were only classmates and are now colleagues. Lin Xiao is confused by this unsolicited explanation. She reassures him with a smile, unaware of his deeper meaning. She mentions Mr. Lin Jian's upcoming discharge, hinting that time is running out for their conversation. Dr. Gu lightheartedly comments on how Mr. Lin Jian is pampered by Lin Xiao and her mother, wishing he had someone to care for him in the same way. Lin Xiao jokes that he would need to get sick for that to happen, and they share a laugh. When Dr. Gu asks about her future plans, Lin Xiao expresses her determination to return to school and pursue her dream of playing the cello. Their playful banter continues as Dr. Gu reflects on his own school days, and Lin Xiao teases him about feeling old, which stings him slightly as he realizes she sees him as distant. Excited, Lin Xiao invites Dr. Gu to her upcoming party, urging him to attend. Although she wants both Dr. Gu and Dr. Gao Shi there, Dr. Gu feels a bit hurt that her focus is more on Dr. Gao Shi's attendance. Meanwhile, Mr. Lin Jian is preparing to leave the hospital, and Li Hui tries to get Dr. Gu's personal number. Lin Xiao advises against it, but Li Hui persists and reveals that Dr. Gu gave his number to her instead. Dr. Gu later enters to check on Mr. Lin Jian and gives Lin Xiao notes on post-surgery care, receiving her heartfelt thanks. In another area of the hospital, Sen excitedly presented a cafe plan to Cheng, eager to discuss its implementation. However, Cheng, clearly tired and uninterested, expressed his reluctance to visit the location San had found for the cafe. After his surgery, Mr. Lin Jian returned to the hospital for chemotherapy, where Lin Xiao was surprised to learn that Dr. Gao Shi would now be in charge of his treatment. Concerned, she explained to her father that a new doctor, Dr. Gao Shi, would be overseeing his care. Sensing her discomfort, Mr. Lin Jian asked why she seemed upset, and Lin Xiao admitted that they had grown used to Dr. Gu's care, and now her father wasn't feeling well after the treatment. Worried about her father's inability to eat, Lin Xiao voiced her concerns to Dr. Gao Shi, who reassured her that changes in appetite were normal post-chemotherapy. Still concerned, Lin Xiao tried reaching out to Dr. Gu, but he didn't respond as he was on break. Undeterred, she sent him a message, and her mother expressed admiration for Dr. Gu, saying, "I love Dr. Gu because he has a kind heart." Together, they struggled to help Mr. Lin Jian, who was nauseated and refusing all food. His wife tried offering various dishes, but nothing appealed to him. Just then, Dr. Gu entered the room, and Lin Xiao felt an immediate sense of relief. Dr. Gu suggested several dishes, but Mr. Lin Jian stubbornly refused until he mentioned a specific pastry. Mr. Lin Jian brightened at the suggestion, and Lin Xiao quickly volunteered to fetch it, thanking Dr. Gu. Mr. Lin Jian also expressed his gratitude. While they enjoyed the pastry, Dr. Jiang arrived and was surprised to see Mr. Lin Jian eating. Lin Xiao proudly credited Dr. Gu for the success. Dr. Jiang raised an eyebrow, noting that Dr. Gu must care a lot about them, given that he had just come out of surgery himself. Later, Lin Xiao returned home and sent Dr. Gu a heartfelt thank you message before settling down to practice her cello. However, her hand hurt. Meanwhile, Dr. Gu, upon opening a book, found the concert ticket Lin Xiao had given him and decided to attend the event, informing Dr. Gao Shi that he would miss the seminar. Excited about the concert, Lin Xiao eagerly prepared. But during practice, Lin Xiao's hands trembled due to overuse, causing her pain. Concerned, Mr. Jin advised her to rest, warning her not to jeopardize her career for one performance. Devastated, Lin Xiao stepped outside in tears. Dr. Gu, seeing her upset, grew concerned. After the concert, one of Lin Xiao's classmates asked to take a photo with her. In her distress, Lin Xiao accidentally knocked over her classmate's instrument. Meanwhile, Dr. Gu encountered an acquaintance backstage, who introduced him to his daughter, Han, the orchestra's principal cellist. Despite this, Dr. Gu's attention remained on Lin Xiao, who was still upset over the incident. He intervened, complimenting her performance, though she sarcastically asked what he enjoyed about her playing the triangle. Dr. Gu reassured her that her cello was fine and promised to cover any damages if needed. The classmate asked, "Who are you?" and Lin Xiao quickly responded that Dr. Gu was one of her fans, pulling him away from the awkward situation. She asked why he had come, and he revealed that he attended the concert as invited. Realizing he was there for her, Lin Xiao expressed her gratitude, touched that he had stood up for her. As they walked together, Dr. Gu noticed her cold hands and gently held them, making her smile. When she asked what he was doing, he teased her back. Observing the coldness of her hands, he warned her about potential arthritis and suggested seeing an orthopedic doctor, which frustrated her. She pulled her hands away and thanked him, realizing they were indeed cold. In a sweet gesture, Dr. Gu draped his jacket over her shoulders and continued to walk her home. Once inside her apartment, a wave of happiness swept over Lin Xiao as she realized she was still wearing Dr. Gu's jacket. As she removed it, a concert ticket slipped out and fell to the floor, bringing back memories of when she had invited him. It suddenly dawned on her that he had indeed come to the concert for her. Excited, she rushed to the window and saw him still standing outside. She called out, asking why he hadn't left yet. With a gentle smile, he replied that he wanted to make sure she was okay. Grateful, she thanked him again for helping her that day and reminded him that he had forgotten his suit. He casually told her to bring it to him later. Dr. Gu felt a surge of joy when he received a friend request from Lin Xiao, his heart lifting at the sight. Later, while chatting on the phone at home, his father called for a serious talk. His father reminded him that now that he had a job, it was time to think about marriage and suggested Dr. Gao Shi as a good match. However, Dr. Gu firmly replied that he would make his own decisions, clarifying that he and Dr. Gao Shi were just colleagues, and marriage wasn't on his mind. During the conversation, his mother added that many doctors marry within the profession because it helps them understand each other's demanding lives. Feeling pressured, Dr. Gu began searching for an apartment to rent, craving independence from his parents' expectations. The next day, he organized his belongings at the hospital, planning to stay there temporarily. He texted Lin Xiao, telling her not to worry about cleaning the suit and to just bring it to the hospital. Determined to see Dr. Gu, Lin Xiao washed the suit, but accidentally ruined it with bleach, drastically changing its color. She made her way to the hospital, offering Dr. Gu a Pepsi as they walked together. When Lin Xiao finally handed over the ruined suit, she joked that he could punish her however he liked. Dr. Gu noticed the damage and she immediately offered to replace it. Instead, he asked to see her hands. With a flicker of nervousness, she showed them to him, worried about his reaction. But with a kind smile, he reminded her that he was a doctor, not a teacher. As he examined her hands, concern crossed his face, and he told her that she really needed to see an orthopedic specialist. Lin Xiao was surprised when Dr. Gu revealed that he had already made an appointment for her. Dr. Gu suggested they have lunch together, and she happily agreed. In a different setting, Cheng was asleep in a hotel room when his mother arrived to wake him. His father was away on a business trip, and Cheng asked his mother for money to start a new project. Initially refusing, she eventually gave in after he promised that this would be the last time, wanting to prove to his father that he wasn't a failure. At lunch, Dr. Gu and Lin Xiao sat together, with Gu focused on finding healthy food. As they joked, Dr. Gu extended his hand toward hers, and Lin Xiao teasingly asked if he found the restaurant suitable. When she reached out to hold his hand, she was surprised as he turned it over to sanitize it, making her giggle. As they ate, Dr. Gu reminded her about compensating him for the suit. Lin Xiao, slightly worried, promised to replace it, hoping it wouldn't be too expensive. Dr. Gu reassured her, mentioning he had something else in mind. He was looking to rent an apartment and asked if she could help him. Her eyes sparkled with excitement, and she eagerly offered her assistance. When Dr. Gu asked when they would go apartment hunting, Lin Xiao teased him for being old-fashioned, suggesting that everything was now done online. The next day, Lin Xiao went to the orthopedic doctor, where she unexpectedly ran into Dr. Gu, who had come to check on her. She told him the doctor had advised her to rest for 15 days, and with a serious tone, he warned her to avoid any physical activities during that time. Frustrated, she grabbed her cello and poured her emotions into the music. Just then, Dr. Gu called, apologizing for the late hour and asking about her father's recovery. Relieved, Lin Xiao informed him that Mr. Lin Jian was getting better. Dr. Gu, worried, asked if she was still playing the cello. Lin Xiao admitted she was practicing non-stop since coming home. He expressed concern and advised her to stop and rest, as it wasn't good for her health. She tried to reassure him but lied when he asked if she was following the doctor's advice by not playing. With a playful tone, he asked her to help him find an apartment and jokingly demanded she send him a list of 100 options. Lin Xiao was shocked, exclaiming, 100 apartments. Before she could respond, he hung up, knowing it would distract her from over-practicing. Despite her fatigue, she finished the list by morning and sent him an email. When Dr. Gu received it, he called her immediately, advising her to get proper rest. With a rebellious tone, Lin Xiao insisted she was going to play the cello again. Just when Lin Xiao was about to relax, Dr. Gu asked her to categorize the apartments by location, distance from the hospital, and price. Shocked, she questioned how she was supposed to manage that. Dr. Gu teasingly reminded her she owed him for the ruined suit, to which she reluctantly agreed. While Gu smiled to himself, knowing he was keeping her engaged. Exhausted, Lin Xiao received another call from Dr. Gu, who praised her work and encouraged her to sleep for at least 8 hours. She asked for a longer break, noting she hadn't slept at all, but Dr. Gu teased her, saying she was eager to start playing the cello again. He promised to meet her after her rest to review the apartments. The next morning, Dr. Gu surprised her by arriving with breakfast. When she asked about the gesture, he explained that she'd need energy for the busy day ahead. They set off to tour various apartments, but Dr. Gu found flaws in every one, frustrating Lin Xiao. Overwhelmed, she declared that she had enough and wanted to go home to practice. Unfazed, Dr. Gu insisted they continue. When she turned away, he followed, explaining that everything he was doing was for her benefit. He urged her to stop playing the cello to prevent further injury to her hands and offered to continue the search on his own. However, Lin Xiao, still determined, emphasized her commitment to achieving her dreams. Dr. Gu gently took her hand and reminded her to care for her hands, especially for her fans, of which he was one. Encouraged, Lin Xiao smiled and agreed to continue the search. Together, they visited one final apartment that Lin Xiao deemed perfect, and Dr. Gu finally agreed. Dr. Gao Shi contacted Dr. Gu's mother, informing her about the apartment rental. Dr. Gu called Lin Xiao to tell her he would pick her up for lunch, but she insisted on taking the metro instead. He playfully asked what she planned to wear, reminding her it was supposed to rain. His concern made her smile. Meanwhile, Dr. Gu's mother called him, urging him to come home for a discussion. She was surprised to hear that he was renting an apartment. Dr. Gu explained that he couldn't come home just yet because he had plans with Lin Xiao. His mother was caught off guard and tried to convince him to return and talk to his father about moving out, but he stood firm, saying he needed his own space. Knowing he had to accompany his mother for a talk, Dr. Gu sent a message to Lin Xiao, letting her know he'd be late. Lin Xiao agreed to wait for him at the landlord's office. She felt a wave of happiness at his thoughtfulness. As Lin Xiao waited at the landlord's office, Dr. Gu faced a serious conversation with his father. His phone buzzed with a call from Lin Xiao, but he chose not to answer, feeling the weight of his father's stern presence. Meanwhile, the landlord grew impatient, urging Lin Xiao to hurry. Her anxiety mounted, and she sent Dr. Gu another message. But, sensing the tension between himself and his father, Dr. Gu turned off his phone, not wanting to risk any awkwardness during their conversation. His father insisted they weren't trying to control him, but Dr. Gu remained resolute in his decision to move out. Wrapping up the conversation quickly, he excused himself and rushed to meet Lin Xiao. By the time Dr. Gu arrived, it was too late. Lin Xiao had just found out that the landlord had rented the apartment to someone else. Visibly upset, she apologized for failing to secure the place. Surprised, Dr. Gu reassured her that it was his fault for being late. He then suggested they take a break from the apartment hunt and go out for lunch. At the restaurant, they sat down to eat, but Dr. Gu quickly became distracted by a discussion about the animal digestive system, oblivious to the delicious meal in front of them. Lin Xiao stared at him, bewildered by the inappropriateness of the conversation. Sensing her discomfort, Dr. Gu apologized, admitting that work often consumed his mind. Later that day, Lin Xiao messaged Dr. Gu, assuring him not to worry about the apartment and promising to keep searching for him. After their exchange, she found herself lost in thoughts of him, imagining playful scenarios and charming moments. But reality soon returned, and she reminded herself that the affection she felt might be one-sided. Convincing herself it wasn't love, just an illusion, she resolved to keep her emotions in check. The next day, Lin Xiao was thrilled when she learned her neighbor was moving and would be renting out their apartment. Eager to impress Dr. Gu and to have him live close by, she hurried over to clean and prepare the space. She spent hours organizing it meticulously, excited at the prospect of showing him the perfect place. However, her plans were thwarted when Dr. Gao Shi got wind of her efforts. Determined to keep Lin Xiao out of the picture, Dr. Gao Shi sent Dr. Gu a video showcasing her own apartment. When Lin Xiao arrived at the hospital to present her findings, she was blindsided by Dr. Gao Shi, who bluntly told her that it was pointless to continue her search, as she had already found an apartment for Dr. Gu. She even showed a video of him checking it out, leaving Lin Xiao feeling crushed and angry with herself for thinking about him so much. Upset, Lin Xiao ignored Dr. Gu's calls that evening. Meanwhile, her friend San, frustrated by Lin Xiao's heartache, decided to confront Dr. Gu. She met with him, questioning his intentions and accusing him of playing with Lin Xiao's feelings. Taken aback and confused, Dr. Gu listened as Sen revealed how hard Lin Xiao had worked to find him an apartment, showing him the file she had prepared. As he looked through it, surprise and a hint of guilt flickered across his face. Back at home, Lin Xiao was still simmering with frustration, unable to get Dr. Gu off her mind. That night, her thoughts of him kept her awake. The next morning, Dr. Gao Shi received a call confirming that Dr. Gu had rented yet another apartment. Later that day, as Lin Xiao groggily woke up and glanced out the window, she was met with a delightful surprise. Dr. Gu was standing outside, smiling brightly at her. Discovering that the apartment next to hers had become available, he had rushed over to secure it. Overwhelmed with joy, Lin Xiao could hardly believe her eyes. She quickly asked her mother what had happened, only to learn that Dr. Gu had taken the key from her. Her heart racing, she hurried outside to greet him, thrilled by the thought of them becoming neighbors. As Dr. Gu entered her home, there was a new spark of connection between them. They exchanged shy glances and shared laughter, both excited but hesitant about the new closeness in their relationship. Later, they went shopping together, and Dr. Gu surprised her by buying her a pair of slippers, a gesture that made her heart flutter. Days later, Lin Xiao went to the hospital to ask Dr. Gu something important. He was headed to a lunch with his colleagues and invited her to join. However, Dr. Gao Shi couldn't hide her jealousy over their closeness. Even when Dr. Gu spoke with colleagues, his eyes frequently wandered back to Lin Xiao, his affection for her undeniable. Lin Xiao, growing restless with her own swirling emotions, watched Dr. Gu, feeling more and more jealous. When Dr. Gu excused himself to the bathroom, the hospital director approached Lin Xiao, commending both Dr. Gu and Dr. Gao Shi for their excellent care of her father. Lin Xiao thanked him, but the director went further, suggesting that she and Dr. Gu made a great couple. While Dr. Gao Shi beamed at the compliment, Lin Xiao's jealousy intensified. The director even asked why Dr. Gu and Dr. Gao Shi hadn't married yet, implying that a serious conversation with Dr. Gu was needed. Overwhelmed, Lin Xiao excused herself, tears threatening to spill as she grappled with the idea that Dr. Gu might truly love Dr. Gao Shi. She couldn't help but wonder if she had been wrong all along, if he had been playing with her emotion. When Dr. Gu returned and learned that Lin Xiao had left, frustration boiled over. His colleagues, including a surprised Dr. Gao Shi, began discussing his relationship with Lin Xiao. Unable to contain himself, Dr. Gu declared that Lin Xiao wasn't just another patient's family member, she was the only girl he loved, deserving of respect. His bold admission left everyone, including Dr. Gao Shi, in stunned silence. Determined to fix things, Dr. Gu rushed after Lin Xiao. He found her, but she was unwilling to listen, too hurt by the situation. Bursting with emotion, Lin Xiao accused him of keeping his feelings hidden from her, while everyone else seemed to know. She felt foolish, as if she had been the last to realize the depth of their connection. Seeing her tears, Dr. Gu couldn't hold back any longer. He gently pulled her into his arms and confessed that his heart raced only for her. He admitted he was madly in love with her, and that he wanted her to be his wife. Lin Xiao's sorrow melted away, replaced by pure joy as she realized the truth. Dr. Gu did love her. With excitement, she confessed her own feelings, affirming her love for him. He smiled and asked her to say it again, and she happily repeated, "I love you, and I'm crazy about you." Their long overdue confession filled the air with joy, and they finally embraced their feelings for one another.